So today we're going to talk about Gulliver's Travels by the Anglo-Irish writer Jonathan Swift. Gulliver's Travels was first published in 1726 and it is a satire of human nature and travel literature. The book's full title is a mouthful: Gulliver's Travels, or Travels into Several Remote Nations of the World, in 4 parts, by Lemuel Gulliver, first a surgeon and then a captain of several ships. But as usual, before I talk about the book, I would like to speak a little bit about its author, Jonathan Swift. So, Jonathan Swift was born in Dublin in 1667. His family was English. He belonged to the dominant class in what was then a British colony, Ireland. His father, whose name was also Jonathan, died of syphilis before he was born, and then his mother left baby Jonathan, little Johnny, in charge of his uncle Godwin Swift. So Jonathan never met his father and hardly spent any time at all with his mother. Jonathan Swift attended Trinity College Dublin, so he was also an educated man. He tried to make it in England, but because of his political associations, he couldn't make it in England, and in the end went back to Ireland, where he spent most of his life. He was a minister of the church in Ireland. Now, Jonathan Swift is mainly known as a satirist, but he also wrote a lot of political pamphlets. The main 2 political parties back then in that part of the world were the Whigs and the Tories. And as far as I'm aware, Jonathan Swift sympathized with both. Now, Jonathan Swift died in Dublin in 1745 at the age of 77. Okay, now let's talk about Gulliver's Travels now. Now, travel literature was popular in the 18th century, and Swift must have read a lot of it because he was able to make fun of it in Gulliver's Travels. I know that I said in the introduction that Gulliver's Travels is a novel, but that's not the best way to define it. More accurately, I would say that Gulliver's Travels is a satire. Now, one of the main characteristics of travel literature is the level of detail that writers go into, and that's one aspect, or one of the aspects, that Swift satirizes about travel literature in his book. Now, a good book to read before you read or after you read Gulliver's Travels would be Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, which also came out at the same time or around the same time. Both books, however, couldn't be more different despite dealing with some of the same issues. Now, I would suggest perhaps reading Robinson Crusoe first, because it is the book that takes everything that Gulliver's Travels is going to satirize seriously. Now, I talked about Robinson Crusoe last week, and you can check out that review if you haven't already. There's a link to it in the description box for this video. So I'm not really going to talk about Robinson Crusoe anymore right now in this video. Now, in Gulliver's Travels, we get descriptions of countries that only existed in Jonathan Swift's imagination, and those countries are so fascinating. This might remind you also of the great novel Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino, which could also be a great companion to Gulliver's Travels, and which I also happen to have reviewed here on my channel. But if you have never read Gulliver's Travels, you might think it is a children's book, and if that's the case, then you are wrong, because like Robinson Crusoe, it is true there are later versions of Gulliver's Travels that are geared toward younger readers, and those later versions only focus on the adventure elements of the original. And of course, Gulliver's Travels has also inspired numerous TV and movie adaptations. But if your idea of what Gulliver's Travels is about comes from those children's versions and movies, you should really read it, because it is a lot more than that. Now, Gulliver's Travels is a biting socio-political satire. That's what it is. It is not an adventure book for children. And I blame that idea that it's a book for children on the Victorians, because in the 19th century there were editions of Gulliver's Travels that were illustrated and geared to that younger readership. And unfortunately, that is also how this book is still seen by many people, even though we now have editions by the likes of Penguin Classics or Oxford Press, so not children's editions. Now, let's get back to the book. So Gulliver himself, he goes on 4 travels in the course of the novel. Each of those travels works as an excuse for Swift to discuss issues that are, for the most part, universal, but also relevant to the time, to Anglo-Irish politics of that time. Now, one of the brilliant things that Swift does in this novel, or in this book, is playing with perspective, with point of view. Because Gulliver sometimes is a giant and sometimes is tiny compared to the people he meets. He not only sees everything differently, but he is also seen differently himself. Now, let me talk about each of the 4 voyages in the book. I'm not going to spoil anything about the plot, don't worry about that. I'm just going to tell you where he goes in each of those journeys and why I think each of them may be significant. So the first journey, which is perhaps one of the most famous ones, is to Lilliput. He's a castaway, and when he wakes up on this strange place, he finds himself tied down. The inhabitants of Lilliput are tiny, which makes Gulliver in turn a giant to them. By making everyone tiny except for Gulliver, Swift exposes us as the small, insignificant creatures that we truly are. That idea is only reinforced on the second voyage, in which Gulliver gets to a country called Brobdingnag, where he meets people who are a lot bigger and taller than he is. So this time, Gulliver is the one confronted with his own insignificance and powerlessness. Also, being confronted by people who are 12 times his size, I believe, Gulliver has to deal with how grotesque people are, because everything is blown out of proportion from his point of view. So just think about how disgusting it would be to be able to see every pore, every hair, every spot in everybody's body so close up, so up close and so big. And how about the smell? I mean, take a minute to think about that. If you think BO is bad in public transportation, imagine how unbearable it would be if everyone else was 12 times your size. Now, in his third voyage, Gulliver visits Laputa, Balnibarbi or Balniburbi, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, Lagnag, Glubdubbrib, and Japan. The latter, of course, is the only real country that Gulliver goes to in the book. Now, Laputa is fascinating because it's a flying island where scientific knowledge and theories rule, but where the inhabitants are incapable of putting any of their vast knowledge to any practical use. Okay, so what's the use? And in his fourth and last voyage, Gulliver gets to Houyhnhnms. I think the point is that it's impossible to pronounce. Okay, this country is inhabited by talking racehorses. And talking about language, each of the countries Gulliver visits has its own language, and he manages to learn all of those languages. Now, Gulliver's travels, I think, exposes the silliness and arbitrariness of customs, habits, traditions, conventions. In his last voyage to the country inhabited by talking horses that I was just talking about, I think it's where we find Swift's sharpest criticism, because he deals with our animal nature in that chapter. In that country, which I'm not going to try to name again, animals are noble, rational, and good, and human beings, us, are the beasts in that country. Now, Gulliver's Travels satirizes the world as we know it now. Yeah, now. Because that world was beginning to form back then in the 18th century.